Are you tired of spending your time and money chasing strategy after strategy only to discover what worked 10, 5, or even 2 years ago is not working now? Things shift fast in the online space, and if you're not keeping up, you're getting left behind. It's time for something different. Welcome to the Marketing, Media, and Money Podcast, where every single episode will be jam-packed with proven, profitable strategies, behind-the-scenes secrets, and what's working now resources from industry experts and global influencers to help you scale your business, shorten your learning curve, and stand out in a crowded, noisy marketplace. And now, your host, award-winning marketing and media strategist, and international speaker, Patty Farmer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Marketing, Media, and Money Podcast. I'm your host, Patty Farmer, and I'm really looking forward to sharing today's industry expert with you. You are going to love this episode if you like to guest on podcasts or if you are a host, because we are going to deep dive into the monetization of that, the myths, what to do, what not to do, and everything in between. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. So Michelle Glogovac is the founder and CEO of the MSL Collective, a full-service podcast production and PR agency. After an 18-year career in corporate aviation, Michelle discovered her love of all things podcasting. She works with entrepreneurs and business owners to niche down, grow their business and visibility while ensuring their message reaches the masses. As a natural relationship maker, she is known as a podcast matchmaker because of her uncanny skills of creating collaboration between guests and hosts that bring education, knowledge, and experience to audiences around the world. And today we have her on the show, and she has been so wonderful about going to be so generous and really share everything she's learned. And so let's make sure that we give her a big welcome. Thanks so much, Michelle, for being here with me.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
I am too, because they don't know this, but every time you and I get on the phone could almost be a podcast in itself. Like
we need to start recording them.
I know. We really do, because, you get two people who both guest on a lot of podcasts and are both hosts on a lot of podcasts. It's like really, honestly, we have so much, and then just the back and forth is just so wonderful. I have never walked away from a conversation with you that I didn't learn something.
Oh, I appreciate that. Same here. Thank you.
That's awesome, right? So
yeah.
Let's dive right in. So first, 18 years in aviation, corporate, that's pretty interesting. But how did you, I guess really what I want to know is, what was that aha moment where you thought, you know what, this isn't what I want to do anymore, but this is what I really want to do? Because you didn't just wake up and say, oh, I think I'll do podcast production, right? So there's a story. There's always a story. So let's share some of those aha moments in your journey.
Yeah. So I completely stumbled into aviation to begin with. I needed a part-time job in college. I didn't have a car and I could walk to the airport. So that made perfect sense. And I got a salary and benefits after graduating. So why not just stay with it? It was easy enough. And I did it for 18 years. I traveled all over the country. And then I got married and had kids. And my whole perspective on, I want to travel and, go see things changed, because now I traveled with an entourage. I had 2 babies, 12 months apart, a husband who's also in corporate aviation, and we brought a nanny along everywhere we went. So it became tiresome. It became costly to actually travel for work. And then I was laid off. And after you've spent so much time with, a company and you think they're dedicated to you the way you're dedicated to them, to have that happen, it sparks something inside of you that says, you know what, maybe they weren't as dedicated to me as I was to them. So what can I do going forward? Because aviation was never really my passion to begin with. I was a law major. I have my BA and my master's in law. But, what is it that I want to do? And I really grappled with that for a few months and I tried things that I was good at, like event planning, because I'd done networking events for many years. I did some social media because I had a wine blog for a number of years, but they still didn't do for me what I wanted. I wanted to spend more time with my kids. I didn't want my head, deep into a phone, engaging on Instagram accounts and whatnot. And I had a friend actually put me in a Facebook group of a life and business coach who was launching a podcast. And this is in 2018. I did not know how to listen to a podcast. I didn't know the purple button was on my iPhone. It was a mystery to me, how to listen to a podcast. And I started listening to hers, and I discovered that, we all have a purpose and a passion in life, but how do we get to that? How do we figure out what that passion is? And I decided I was on a mission to figure it out. And she actually reached out to me and said, "You're listening to my content. You're obviously enjoying it. Do you want to start pitching me to be on other podcasts?" And I went, "Well, yeah, like this is a no-brainer." I did sales for 18 years. It's all about relationships and creating them and, cold calls. I had all of this down, and I knew this client, inside and out. So it became the natural fit. And in getting to know people, and it's a whole new market, an industry that I didn't know before, but in growing with it, I've fallen in love with it. And finding that podcasts are a platform that are free for every listener out there, and you can listen to any topic you want, whether it's something that's, comedy based or true crime based, every interest that there is, you can learn about your business, you can learn about parenting. And I loved that it was a platform that offered the ability to get messages out there that other people needed to hear. And to me, that brought me purpose, knowing that my job was no longer to save wealthy people money on their fuel when they fly in their own aircraft, to now I get to ensure that possibly someone's life is changing because they know they're no longer alone in their journey, no matter what it is, that their business is now going to be able to grow because they're getting new skills and tips and tools that they otherwise wouldn't have. And to me, that was, yes, that's my new passion. That is my purpose. And that is why I'm doing now what I do.
I love that. Podcasting on so many levels is the answer, really, because one, it has a low barrier of entry should you decide to become a host, right? It's easy, it's inexpensive. There are so many resources out there now. So I think that that's one of the reasons. And because it's something that we can do while we drive, while we're at the gym, while we're exercising at home, while we're working. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it, and there's a lot of ways to enjoy it, which basically means that there's a built-in audience, right? So there's very few topics that somebody doesn't, like you said, from parenting to exercise to business. There are so many of them. But let's kind of break this down a little bit. So I know that you are an expert from both sides of the mic, like me, right? We can talk about guest and hosting. But so that we don't confuse everybody, we're going to talk a little bit about hosting first, and then we'll go ahead and switch over and talk to everybody about being a guest so that they get both sides and they kind of don't get confused. So what I want to say is, what do you think that when you launched your podcast that you wish you would have known when you very first started? You know now, but what do you wish you would have known then, right from the beginning?
I think that so often there's two things that I think I wish I would have known. One is that you should not have expectations of having downloads that are just incredible numbers, that slow growth is absolutely okay and it will happen, and that the key is in being consistent with your content. The other thing that I think is overlooked so often, and although I knew this going in because I had produced before I hosted, is that it takes a lot of time to create a podcast. I have figured out it's about 4 hours to create an episode, because you're creating the content, you're recording, you're editing, you're doing show notes, you're doing graphics. There's a lot that goes into a podcast episode that I think people don't realize that it is time consuming, but it's rewarding in the end. And when you do a podcast, there's different ways that you can repurpose this content, which ultimately then will save you time down the road. So you're not doing additional blog posts or social media content because you've done a podcast episode. So I think the keys are that consistency and how much time that it will take to do it. And that in the end, you will see podcast growth, but don't expect it to be overnight success, because in most cases, just as we see with, stars and celebrities and everything else, most people aren't an overnight success. They don't wake up and go, woohoo, I just rolled out of bed and, I won an Emmy or something. It takes years to do, what they do as an expert. And not that podcasting is going to take years, but it can take a number of months for people to catch on and to find you and to listen. And so I think patience is just something that you should be armed with and prepared for. But as long as you're consistent, you're going to see that growth.
I think another thing that I think is really important too, that I learned early on too, was to not compare myself to other podcast hosts, because one of the things that I think is really important is, even though we all have the same barrier of entry, right? We all can start one tomorrow if you want. The fact of the matter is, somebody can decide that they want to get their message out. They have this, purpose and passion for wanting to share. But the reality is that they may have, 200, people in their audience, right? And then there could be somebody else who has 100,000 people in their audience. So I think people should be very, very careful about comparing their podcast numbers to other people, because there's a lot of factors from day one that can go into that. And I hear sometimes people say, oh, well, I don't know why my podcast isn't doing as good as Amy Porterfield. Well, let's look at all the things that Amy Porterfield did before she decided to have that podcast, right? So there's a lot of different things. So I think really being careful about who you compare yourself to. First of all, I don't think people should compare themselves to anybody, exactly. Right? Mm-hmm. But if you are going to look, make sure that you realize that what you are looking at makes sense, and not just looking at somebody's podcast of where you want to be, not where they are right now. So I think that's important. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And that goes along with something I tell all of my clients too, is that to me, the purpose of my podcast is that I want to help other people. I want to help business owners. But if I can change just one life, then that in itself is life-changing for me. So I'm not out to, change the world for everybody or, reach 1 million people. It's really about that one person that you connect with, and in making a difference in that way. I don't think any of us are going to be able to reach the entire world in some capacity, but to recognize that just one person, in helping that person, is really what it's all about, and can be life-changing for everybody.
I agree with you. That's why you and I get along so good. That has also always been my mission too. It is when I pick up the mic, whether I am on a stage as a speaker or whether it is being a podcast host or being a podcast guest, it really is about who is on. It's never about us, right? It's always about them. Who can we touch? So I think that is really important. But just to give everybody a kind of a frame of reference right now, I know you do podcast production, and I have to tell you, I am a firm believer in work in your brilliance and hire other people to work in theirs. But there are people who truly, really do want to edit their own podcast as well. So with that frame of reference, how techie, on a scale of 1 to 10, do you think somebody needs to be to do their own podcast? Because it's also about time, right? Sometimes in people's business, they have more time than money, and sometimes they have more money than time, right? So it's different for every person. But I think I get asked that a lot. Well, how techie do you have to be? So what would you say? How techie does somebody have to be to have a podcast?
I think you have to be willing to learn and to take instruction in order to figure out something such as editing. I don't think that podcasting in and of itself is something that's truly techie and difficult. If you know how to go on a Zoom call, then you can basically record a podcast. You can do an interview. There's other platforms that you can use that it's really just knowledge base of, I can utilize Zencaster, for an example, And it's not that you have to learn how to use it. You click a few buttons and that's it. Editing, though, is a bit different because you have to figure out whatever software you're using. If you have GarageBand, I have GarageBand, so I use that for solo episodes. And in figuring out how to toggle for fading and whatnot and adding in your intro, it can just be kind of cumbersome. And editing will take at least, especially as a beginner, twice as long as the episode. This is why it takes 4 hours to produce a single episode, because of the time it takes to do these additional things. I am not a fan of editing. I can, fumble my way through it. So I do outsource to an editor because I think if he's a master at it, then he should be doing it. That's not my area of expertise at all, but it's doable. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I think it depends on who you are. Can you follow instructions? I have instructions, step by step with, guides of screenshots and whatnot. And so if you can follow something like that, then you can get through editing an episode. Editing, I'm going to say it's about a 7-8 on difficulty.
Okay, that kind of makes sense. So I feel like sometimes it's just as important to know what not to do as it is to know what to do, right? Shortening your learning curve is always really great. So before we really start diving into really some really good nuggets here, let's kind of get those out of the way first. So what would you say is just a few mistakes that you see hosts make that end up costing them time or money, or just not getting the results that they probably want to have, that are just very common ones that as a host they make?
One thing that I really see is in regards to promoting your own podcast, people aren't doing it. When you look at an Instagram account, if you host a podcast, then your podcast name should be in your bio. It is so often that I know that someone hosts a podcast, but I can't find out which one it is for the life of me. And I think that is such a huge mistake. You shouldn't be afraid to promote your podcast, especially the point is, you want downloads to be up and you want to increase your audience numbers. But if nobody knows what podcast you host, then you can't do that. You're not going to grow. So I would say that's one big mistake that people make, is not promoting themselves enough, not promoting it across multiple platforms. Just because it goes live on Apple Podcasts doesn't mean that's the only place that you can make it live. Be on all of the other platforms of Spotify and, Google Podcasts, and ensuring that you're in all of these places. And yes, it takes work, but it's more of a setup type of thing where it then automatically releases itself. So I would say that's one big mistake. Talking about yourself in a way that comes off as salesy. So nobody wants to listen to a commercial all the time, especially when it's your free time. It's not that you're watching TV and you expect to have commercials in between your show. When someone sits down to listen to a podcast, they have an expectation to learn something, to get something out of the time they're spending listening to you. So to make an episode that is all about what you do, how people can work with you, I think it's completely wrong. The point to me of having a podcast is to offer your expertise and your education to others, whether that's in a solo episode or an interview, and to really offer this all for free. You're not coming on here to say, work with me, do this with me, because ultimately one of the best kept secrets is that people who listen to you will want to then work with you if they jive with what you're saying. They're going to understand who you are, your personality, the way that you work, and it truly can eliminate cold calls or the need to have one of the calls in which you are trying to sell yourself and say, this is what I do and this is how I like to work and what you'll get out of working with me. When you're in their ear, they're already listening to you and making a decision of, what, I would love to work with Michelle as my producer, because listen to the quality of her podcast, listen to the content she's giving for free. Imagine what it would be like then to work with me versus, I'm a producer and I can do this for you and I can help you do this. it comes off completely different. So I would say those are my top two mistakes that people make and that can ultimately change things for you and the growth in your podcast.
I agree 100%. And kind of shifting just a little bit from mistakes, we all have pet peeves, right? And I am a podcast host, right? But I have to tell you, my biggest pet peeve that a podcast host does is when they invite a guest on, they ask them questions, and then every single thing they say after that is, oh, well, that's what I do for my clients. I blah, blah, blah. And then they actually utilize the guest's value to sell themselves, which I just think is such a bad practice. And it almost makes you wonder sometimes, like, why did you even have me on here? Right. So that is a pet peeve. I see it a lot, actually. And I don't think they really understand, really the value of bringing on an expert. You're there to serve your audience, right? And so you should be asking somebody who, I have many marketing people on my podcast because I feel like they have a different perspective, like maybe a twist on something different. We can have a great conversation about it. If they do something differently than me or offer a service that I don't, I'm like, great, that's why I have you on my podcast, right? But for somebody who does that, and I have had it done to me several times, and it is a serious pet peeve for me. What's your biggest pet peeve?
Yeah, no, I've had it done to me as well. and I've walked away going, well, why did you even have me on the show? You could have done this solo. And I really take into heart and consideration as I'm doing an interview, I look at the wavelengths of who's talking for how long, because I want to make sure that I'm not talking too much. And, I'll give my input or yes, I agree with that. Another pet peeve of mine is when the host doesn't seem engaged, and you'll pick this up where they say the same thing after every answer from an interviewee, someone who every time there's an answer goes, well, I love that. Oh, I love that. It doesn't feel authentic. It feels like they weren't even listening. And, you can get creative in your responses, and you should, because people aren't going to want to hear over and over, I love that. So that's one of my big pet peeves too, is just not paying attention. You have to be engaged, whether it's, solo episodes are easier because you're all by yourself, but when you are talking to someone else, it's a true conversation. And, not everyone's a natural interviewer. I get that, but you should be able to converse with another human being. And that's what an interview is all about.
Absolutely. And I think that when you are a podcast host, really it is about them, and you're sharing them with your audience, and your role is what kind of conversation can you have that helps them to, bring out the very best of what you already know they offer, because that's why you had them on your podcast in the very beginning, right? Is for that, right? To be of service.
Which brings up another pet peeve of mine is when a host does not research their guest. There are hosts who have people who book guests on their show. I do this for some podcasters, and I provide everything that there is. If there's a book link, if their social media, their bio, what it is. But when they haven't reviewed it and then they just show up for the interview knowing absolutely nothing about the guest, it can be really bad. I've seen disasters happen. When I had a host who was properly prepped but did not read everything, and the guest had a podcast that had a name that could be taken a couple different ways, and the host didn't look at what the actual guest was hosting herself and asked her right away about, oh, so you teach your kids at home? And she's like, no, I do DIY stuff on homes. It was completely different.
Wow.
And they had to stop recording and start over. So do your research, just be prepared.
And I think also that one of the things about that too is I like to be prepared in the sense that you never know, no matter how good it looks on paper, you don't know if somebody's a natural talker. You don't know if they're going to answer in yes, no answers once the camera's on, right? You don't know. And so for me, I always want to be prepared and or be able to read their blogs and be able to say, oh, I love in this blog you did on your site where you talked about this, because that also drives the audience to look at their website. You're helping them. But two, you never know when you have to kind of pull information out of them. I mean, sometimes you can just have a conversation like, oh my gosh, an hour went by and we'll have to have you again. And then there's times where people answer in one sentences and really you're the interviewer, right? So
Right. Yeah. And a good example is if someone has written a book, you should read it. Read it before they come on the show. I recently had an author on one of my shows, and I made sure that I read it, and I had to stay up late one night because I was so busy. But I wanted to be able to pull out examples and say, you know what, I really loved this part of your book when you said this. And it also shows an appreciation for the guest that you did take the time to research them, to read their book, and it makes it, again, authentic. And I think that's one of the biggest things in podcasting that we all have to be is authentic. Be yourself, and don't be afraid that if you don't click with certain people, they're just not your people. But those that you do click with, that's why you're doing a podcast. And it's important just to be yourself and to be the unique person that you are, because that's what's going to draw your ideal listeners.
When people work with you, do you coach them on that and kind of help them through that whole thing so that they know?
I do. Yes. I think that defining your ideal listener is one of the most important parts when you start a podcast, and to create this person, just as you do in business with an ideal client. Who are you talking to? Whether it's your best friend, name that person, put a picture to them. For me, my ideal listener and client is actually a girlfriend of mine named Karen. And so I always have Karen in the back of my mind of what would I tell Karen in this episode? What would I want to write to her in my email? What is it that Karen needs to learn from me in order to get ahead in her business, in motherhood, in life? So I always think about who that is. What do I want to say to them? And that helps me create the content that's going to focus on my ideal listener, my ideal client. And I think that's important, whether it's podcasting or business. Yes. And so, yes, I do coach them on ensuring that we have some sort of a definition around who their target is.
Which I think is really important when somebody does it. So kudos to you for doing that. I think that is really great. Now, I know that when I was reading your website, which is phenomenal, by the way, I know we're going to get into this a little bit later where you're going to share, but I do have to tell you, I love on your website where you have those free resources and stuff, and you're very generous there too. So I think that was really great. I really even like that, even though you talk a lot about podcasts and this is what you do, you even have that Pinterest strategy one on there. And it was really good, really, really good. So I really love that. I think people really, it really says a lot about someone when you can look at their resources. It kind of tells you how they talk, like how they work. You kind of just get a feel for it. So I think that was really good. So thank you so much for having that. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later about the gifts that you have for everybody, but I just wanted to say that I really did love that on your website. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And the reason behind Pinterest is because that is a platform that is underutilized, especially by podcasters. I'm a big fan of repurposing and taking your episode and being able to use it in multiple different places. And Pinterest is one of them. So that is why that resource is up there, because every episode, every quote should be up on Pinterest.
I know, and wouldn't you say, I know, I don't want to go too far off topic, but I love this, what we're saying right now, because I think a lot of times people don't realize that Pinterest is actually a visual search engine. It's not really a social media platform. And so because of that, I know I have my own board for the Marketing Media Money podcast for sure. But I think that sometimes what people don't realize is if you are pinning your podcast like you should, that isn't the only place. There should be tribes you should belong to. There are, if your podcast is, say, about branding, right? Do you also have boards about branding? Whatever, because you should be pinning it there. So it doesn't have to be on a board that's just about podcasts. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's this misconception that years ago, Pinterest was all about recipes and home decor. And it has completely taken a turn that business owners, entrepreneurs, social media experts, everyone is on there now. And it's not just for women either. Men are utilizing Pinterest more and more. And a great resource is Tailwind when you talk about the tribes and being able to schedule your pins. And tribes are groups that have a certain topic. So branding is one of them. There's parenting ones, there's fitness ones, there's literally a topic on everything, just as there is in podcasting. And you join these tribes and you kind of exchange your pinning. So I'll pin one for you if you pin one for me. And now you've just expanded your audience even more. So that's really, what Pinterest is now all about. And I totally agree that you should have multiple boards. I have one that's for entrepreneurs and social media hacks, and I have my favorite podcast episodes, and I'll make sure that I put interviews that I've done there, interviews of my clients. If there's something that I want to drive traffic to, then I put it on there. So I think it's really important to have different types of boards that are on there, but they all come back to you.
Absolutely. Before we shift over to being a guest, right? And before we make that shift, let's talk a little bit about monetization. Everybody always wants to know, how do we make money? Now, I want to say that I believe that when people decide to be a podcast host, that there's many different reasons and they all have different goals, right? Sometimes it's to get their message out. Sometimes they want to get clients. Sometimes it's that they want to have named people, on their podcast. There's a lot of different reasons for a lot of goals and objectives that they have. And I'm sure you deal with that with your clients all the time. But when it comes to making money, right, what would be a few ways that you would say are the best ways to monetize a podcast from a host point of view?
Well, I want to start by saying that you're not going to have an influx of huge money coming in when you launch a podcast. I have had potential clients come to me and say, we'll pay you whatever because we're going to make $10,000 an episode. I'm sorry, I've laughed, but it's comical because podcasting is not all about the money. We're not Joe Rogans who are signing with Spotify for some exclusive deals. There really isn't. It's not going to be a huge money maker in the sense that just because you have a podcast, you're going to make money. You can have sponsors. And if you do choose to have sponsors, then I suggest you relate them to your actual podcast. I can't stand listening to an episode where all of a sudden, it's about, I heard one the other day and it's a great podcast and it was with a celebrity. And in the middle, it was like, do you have your Freshly subscription? Well, I'm not here to talk about food. I don't want the commercial in my ear about food and delivery service and whatever. So I would say make sure you relate it to whatever your podcast is about, first and foremost, if you choose to have sponsors. If you do choose to have sponsors, they will ask you about your downloads, about your numbers, and you have to have at least 10,000 downloads per episode in order for people to start wanting to pay you money for it. There are platforms like Patreon where you can ask people basically for a donation. And if you do that, then I would suggest you make sure you have some sort of bonus features for these people. I am not in the business of podcasting to make money off of the content that I provide. So if somebody's going to pay me to listen to an episode, then I would say give them bonus episodes. Give them something that's over and above and extra because they're now paying you for this. The best way that I think you can monetize your podcast is that it's going to come back to your business. It's going to come back to your services. So in my podcast, you hear the quality of what I produce. You hear the content. You can see where I'm repurposing it. And that is what will bring me business, is because people see what my podcast looks like, even though my podcast isn't about podcasting. I don't sit there and talk about, this is how you're going to launch. I do have episodes on podcasting and pitching, but mine is about business tips for business owners who are just starting out. And it's in this quality that people then want to come and work with me. So you will, and like I said before, it's going to eliminate these cold calls, these people who are trying to vet you. You see this a lot in coaching. that suddenly people want to work with a specific coach because of what they've heard on their podcast, and they like their technique and the way they speak and their methods and methodologies. And that is what's going to help you monetize your podcast in the end. So it's not a direct line. It kind of goes around it.
I agree. I always like to say that the revenue is really in the relationships that you build, right? So I feel like how I have always monetized my podcast is really in the opportunities and the revenue that I make is because, maybe somebody comes on my podcast and then, or listens to a podcast and then says, oh, Patty, I'm going to do this introduction for you because I think they need to, this. So it's not directly related to money, but I think pretty much almost everything we do, right? You get revenue in more than one way. You get revenue in dollars, and you get revenue and opportunities. And sometimes the opportunities are actually more revenue than if somebody had actually paid you dollar for dollar. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's definitely, podcasting is a relationship business. It truly is. Whether it's the relationship with your listeners, the relationship with your guests, it's all about relationships. And that's why I love what I do, because it allows me to create more relationships that I otherwise wouldn't have had, and to meet people like you.
Oh, that's so sweet. I love that. So let's kind of shift now a little bit to being a podcast guest. So one of the first things I want to say is, what do you think is the biggest myth in the podcast industry that when people are thinking about being a guest, that they just keep bumping up that myth, that let's just get rid of that myth right now?
That you don't have something that someone wants to hear, or that what you can speak on, someone else talks about already. Therefore, why would someone want you to be a guest on their show? And it's a myth, because my firm belief, and this is what I tell all of my clients, is that we are all unique. So even though you might have a similar story to what my story is, we're going to tell it in a different way. Your business might be similar to my business, but we're going to operate in a different way. We come at it with a unique perspective, and that is why you should be guesting on podcasts. It's purely as simple as that. And you're going to create a relationship, again, with that host and with a whole new set of audience listeners. Another misconception I would say is that, oh, I have to be on this big podcast. I need to be on Amy Porterfield's because she's got thousands of reviews and listeners. Well, you know what? Those listeners might not be your ideal audience. And it might be the podcast that has 10 reviews, because that is the audience that you want to speak to. Those are your ideal clients. So do not go out with the intention and the goals to land huge podcasts, because they might not move the needle for you the way that a smaller audience will.
I agree with you. I think that a lot of times when people are looking, that's what they're thinking, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I want to be on, John Lee Dumas's, right? I want to be like on Amy Porterfield's. Like that will be the thing. Like that is going to be the all and everything, rather than just thinking about where are the podcasts that serve my audience in a completely different way, which I think is very, very important when pitching too, when you're a guest. Because if you go up against somebody who does the same thing as you, right, which I have a very abundant mentality, right, but you have to be able to tell them, like, here's what I think that I can bring to the table for your audience. Like, this is the conversation I think that we can have. And I think it's really almost as simple as that, is just knowing what the value is. And I loved what you just said about, really knowing what your value is and what that myth is. Because I always like to say all the time, you're not reinventing ice cream. You're just creating your own flavor.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And, something else, when we talk about the size of an audience, I've been grappling with this a lot lately, because I feel like the review numbers on Apple don't truly portray how many listeners there are. Because you look at somebody who has, one example that I was actually using in a Facebook group this week was that the person who was in charge of this Facebook group had 300 and something members in the group, but her podcast only had 70 reviews. And so my question was, why are you all not reviewing this person's podcast because you're in her group? Like, it doesn't make sense to me that she wouldn't have 300 ratings and reviews because that's how many are in her Facebook group that's a private community. And it's this forgotten thing I have found out that people go, well, I listen to the podcast and I hear the host say, oh, leave me a review, but then I'm off doing laundry and I forget. So understand that even though there might not be a ton of reviews, there could be a larger audience behind the host as well. Their Instagram following could be thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, but the reviews might not say that. So it's something that it's part of what I do in my research to investigate all of this and basically stalk hosts. I stalk my clients, I stalk my hosts, and I could be a PI in my next career move. But to realize and recognize that the number of reviews and ratings does not always correlate with how many people are actually listening.
I think that's good. That's what makes you that great matchmaker that you are.
Yes, I'm a stalker, so I will know everything. Yeah. Forget matchmaker. I'm going to now say I'm the stalker. I'm the podcasting stalker.
I love it. Love it. Love it. When you think about it, though, but that really is your gift. And when you're going to hire someone, you always want to hire somebody that truly has the gift of the thing that either you don't want to do, don't have the time to do, right? Or it's just not your area of expertise, right? Hire somebody who literally has that gift. I call that your zone of genius, right? What is your zone of genius? And clearly this is yours, Michelle. So that is really wonderful. So now we have someone who says, okay, so here's my business. I know that I bring value. I do a little speaking here and there or want to. And now I want to be on some podcasts, right? I feel like that would be a good thing for my business. Like, what would you say is the first thing that they should do to get started once they've made that decision so that they don't go out and just start doing all these like terrible pitches and stuff? Like, what should they do first?
Decide on your topics. And I work with all of my clients to niche down in their topics. We want to make them unique and to stand out because, like I said, there's all kinds of people who are doing things, we can all sell. I've done sales. You can do sales. Everyone's doing sales. But what is it about your technique in doing sales? One of the examples I always use is about macaroni and cheese. You can't say that my topic is how to bake macaroni and cheese. But how about how you can bake the best macaroni and cheese that's award-winning from your oven tonight in 30 minutes? Getting really specific on what your topic is what's going to set you apart. That's first and foremost what you should be doing is looking at the topics that you can speak on and getting specific about them. Because you also don't want to go into an interview in which, okay, we're talking about macaroni and cheese. Well, now we're also going to talk about going to the grocery store and how do you create your list? And, it can get too broad. So really be specific because that's what's going to make you stand out. So once you've got your topics and you can stand out, then you create your pitch email. And all of my emails that go out are unique. They are not the same because I actually listen to every podcast that I pitch to. So this can be up to 100 a month. And I relate to the host what it is that I like about their podcast, what it is about a specific episode. And in some cases, it might not be that I relate them to my client specifically, but I'll relate to them because it hit something with me. It resonated with me specifically. And I want to say, this is what I got out of it. Or, I stalked your website and I saw that you also have kids who are 12 months apart and you love drinking wine and I do too. And it's too bad you live here and I live here because I think we would actually connect and be friends. And really making it personable and not just generic. Because as a host as well, I get some really generic bad pitches. And it's important that, to know that somebody's taken the time because ultimately the host is doing you a favor by having you on. And you're now going to get exposure that you otherwise wouldn't have. So to make it that you have done your research, and to provide them with all of the research they would need to do. So including your links, include past interviews that you've done, because I can't tell you how aggravating it is to not know a website, social media. Who is this person that's being pitched to me? I don't have the time, nor am I going to take the time to go Google your name to find out, do you actually exist? Are you an expert on whatever you're claiming to be an expert on? So really making sure that you provide all of the information that you can to the host. Those are the first and foremost, the biggest tips that I have when you decide that you want to start pitching yourself.
You know, one of the things that as a host that is a pet peeve to me when people pitch me is that there's a question I ask on my form is, what would you like our conversation to be about? That's really, I want you to tell me. And it cracks me up sometimes how somebody will put one word there, podcasts, sales. Like now they want me to do all this work that I'm supposed to go, stalk you and figure out all this stuff. Like you're pitching me. Like, give me the information so that I can make a decision. And then if it catches my, I'm like, oh, I love that. I'm going to do my due diligence, but I'm going to make my decision right from looking at that. That's why we have a podcast form, right? So when somebody asks you questions, I think that they should answer the questions, not just have these copy and paste answers that say, oh, I can talk about this or this or whatever. Like, give me the answers that I need. And the reason why I specifically say, what would you like our conversation to be about, is because I want it to be a conversation. And I want to, later on, I want to know all the things about how to serve them, and I'm going to. But the reality is, if you're pitching and you're giving a 1 word or 2 words, just tell us why we should have you on our podcast, that's not going to fly.
Yeah. I've actually replied back to people who have pitched to me and said, your pitch was bad and here's why. And I've done it in a nice way, but I've said, you need to start including this, and this. Yeah. You need to do this if you want to get a yes. And it's really people who are pitching someone else. It's not, I got the most wonderful pitch the other day and the woman was pitching herself and she was spot on everything. And I wrote back to her, I said, this was a fabulous pitch. Congratulations. But the one who needs help, I'm like, you got to do something. If you plan on landing any kind of interviews for the person you're working for, then you need to, up level what you're doing.
I agree with that. I've had a few people pitch me for other people. And I think the biggest thing I notice there is they don't set the expectations correctly for them because they didn't do their work or listen, because when they come on my podcast, they think they're going to just be able to sell. Like they're just like, oh, I don't get to sell my $3,000 program on your podcast? Absolutely not. Oh, well, they told me that I would be able to. Like, no. Right? Absolutely. And a lot of times they come with an expectation, and I really have to do a really good job as a podcast host to tell them you're not going to be able to do that. I've learned and reworded my form over and over and over again every time I see something like, oh, got to tweak that. Oop, got to tweak that. So I think that is really important from somebody who is doing the pitching. I love the way you do it, right? Just listening to you talk about, like they don't really do their work too, right? So if somebody's going to hire somebody, they need to know, well, first of all, you should hire Michelle. But the reality really is when they're thinking about that, do you really want somebody to pitch you in a way that really doesn't make you look good, right? Because podcasters talk to other podcasters, right?
Yeah. And that's, I'm glad you bring that up, because I think that regardless of who you use, myself or other pitchers out there, you should ask to see what they're sending out on your behalf. Not that so you can tweak it per se, or, have input in every email, but I show my clients, there's a generic portion of the email that has, your topics, and I switch them out depending on what we're talking about, who we're targeting. But every email you see in it, there's a template that says, here is where I will insert relating you or myself to the host. And that is all going to change. But you also will see, I've seen pitches come through where all they're changing is you're the host of We'd Love to Get Our Client On, and they plug in your podcast name. And that's not unique at all. And you can tell whether or not it is unique just by reading it. It's very simple. And I think that people should know and recognize if generic pitches are going out, because that's copy and paste. And that is easy. And what I do is not easy. So that is why I charge what I charge, because it is unique to you, to the host, to every podcast. And it's important that you see what it is that you're paying for. And that's one of my biggest things. And then when we talk about sales, I go over this with every single client. This is not your time to shine with your sales. This is not a sales interview. You are there to give your expertise. And at the end of every podcast, we all know the host is going to ask, where can our audience find you? It's a given 9 times out of 10. And that's when you can say your website, your Instagram, whatever it is that you want to direct people to. But it's not your time to say, go buy my book. You need to buy my book. I'm a bestseller. Go buy my book or my course or whatever it is. And I go over that with every single client as well. So those are my big 2.
I think those are really, really important. So I have to say that one of the things that I see podcast hosts as well as guests really kind of fall is in promotion. So let's talk about promotion, right? You know, I will see somebody who is on a podcast and they think promoting means get on Facebook and say, oh, I'm so excited I was on XYZ's podcast. Here's my graphic. And then that's it. They think they get it. First of all, for me, from a marketing standpoint, I'm like, why are you not leveraging that? Right? Like there's, you know, for me, I'm all about how do you leverage media, right? That's kind of my area of expertise. But the thing is, I see it happen over and over and over again that they just don't really know what to do. Like I know for me that I have a lot of things that I do. And also even as a guest, I always try really hard, because I do my due diligence as well, that when I'm talking on somebody else's show, I always try to say something that will make the host shine too. Like when they say something, if I can say in the conversation, oh, and I just read your last XYZ and it was really good. And they're always so thankful, because a good podcast host isn't going to talk about themselves all the time, like you said earlier, right? Mm-hmm. So whenever you can do something like that, that always makes them happy, makes you look good, right? Which is kind of like serendipitous, right? And stuff. But I do see people not really understand how to promote themselves. So let's talk about that. As a podcast guest, what are some of the ways that you could share with the audience that if they're not already doing it, what are some of the ways that maybe they're not thinking of that they can be promoting their podcast episode as a guest?
Yeah. So going along with what you said, putting it in your Instagram stories where it's up for 24 hours and it comes down and leaving it at that is not promoting it. That's one of my biggest pet peeves, is putting it up and letting it come down in 24 hours isn't doing very much for anybody. You can add it to your highlights, having your highlights for your Instagram stories, where you've been interviewed. But in addition to your Instagram stories, you should have it in your feed. And I was just talking to another host about this as well, because you're going to receive all of the social media assets from the episode that you've done. And that's part of what I do, is I make sure that we gather these assets, because so often, and this goes back to a host not promoting their podcast enough, is we won't know that an episode has gone live. I check every single Friday, every podcast that I have booked for clients, to see if our episode has gone live. And you would be surprised at the amount of hosts who have not said, hey, this has gone live. We'd love for you to promote it. So hosts, promote it. Let the interviewee know that it's gone live, because I also share it, even not my own interviews, but my clients' interviews, I share every Friday. And those are in my highlights as well. Putting it in your Instagram feed so that it lives forever. And it doesn't have to be, I know a lot of people, myself included, we've got grids and we follow, I've got quotes, I've got, an image, and it's a certain pattern that we're following. And somebody's podcast artwork might not fit into that feed, but then make it a carousel, because then you're also increasing your Instagram engagement. Put an image of something in the front, and in your caption, you can talk about and tag the host, the podcast that you were on, and make it your next image is of the artwork of the podcast. So you're actually going to do it. It's like a double whammy, where you are promoting it and it's going to stay there, and you're increasing your Instagram feed. Put it on Pinterest, because your Instagram story graphics are the same size that your pins will be. So that's easy to do. Go live on Instagram, go live on Facebook, talk about it. What is it that you're going to get out of? Post it on Facebook. Post it on LinkedIn if it's appropriate. True crime stuff, not so appropriate for LinkedIn. But if we're talking about business things and tips and tools, then you should be on LinkedIn. You can post it on Twitter. Put it in your emails for your email lists. It's not that I want to go to my subscribers and say, look at where I've been, or look at where my clients are, because that's not the type of stuff I want to offer as the knowledge that, you're on my email list because you want to learn something. So I might have at the very bottom of, hey, did you see that I was featured on this podcast? I'd appreciate if you would go link it here. Leave a review. Please leave a review for the podcast. This goes back to what I was saying before. We're not leaving reviews enough. And it takes literally, I did it in my Instagram stories. I did a video, 60 seconds to search for the podcast, hit the 5 stars, type something nice. And one of my tips is when you are leaving your review, put your name, if you're a podcast host, the name of your podcast, and you can put @ and whatever your Instagram handle is. And now people who are reading the reviews might also check you out. So that can be self-serving in and of itself, but just leave a review, rate it and review it. It's so simple. It takes 60 seconds and it goes a far way and it shows appreciation.
I love that. One of my favorite ways, and I think it's really easy, is if the podcast host has a business page on Facebook, or they're a public figure. And so they, if you see they're posting their podcast on their business page like I do, I will always go and leave them a 5-star review. Because what people don't realize is when you do that, that really helps them. But not only that, it doesn't mean you have to have hired somebody to give them a 5-star review. You can say their podcast was great. They had their communication was whatever you want to say. But I always leave them a 5-star review. I don't even tell them I do. And then they get notified that you have left them that 5-star review, which I think really makes you stand out as well as, a guest. I mean, really, honestly, they will talk to other podcasters. You're not going to believe this. Somebody was on my show and this is what they did. Like, that's a really great way too. If I know them or know a little bit more about them, I'll even leave them a LinkedIn recommendation. I'll go to LinkedIn and leave them a recommendation saying, I was on your podcast and, you were a great interview. I love the way you did this, this, and that, so that I can do something for them as well. These are just like really things that just take a few minutes. But when you leave somebody a LinkedIn recommendation, it's like a public testimonial that then they can pull in and use it. And why wouldn't you want that to show up and have them use it? I mean, it can also be a little self-serving too, like you said, right? But I don't think people mind if you're a little bit self-serving if 95% of it is really about them.
Yeah, it's simple actions that go a long, long way. And I think we live in this day and age where these simple actions just aren't happening enough and we forget them. So as much as we can remind other people to do this, we need to do this.
I think that makes sense.
And I practice what I preach. I go and I leave my reviews, and that's why earlier, this week I talked in the Facebook group, like, what are you people doing? Why are you not leaving reviews? It is so simple. And so many people came back and said, thank you for reminding me, because you're right. We should be leaving reviews. We are grateful. We're thankful for the content that we're giving. And we need to show appreciation because podcast hosts are putting in a lot of work and effort and time and money to produce these episodes and to teach us for free all of this content. So just leave a review because it's going to go a long way.
I love that. And here's the question that everybody really wants to know is, from a podcast guest point of view, what are some of the ways that they can monetize being on a podcast?
So one great way is to have a freebie. And although you're giving something away, now you have someone on your email list, and it's going to be a warm lead, not a cold lead, because they've come to you. Again, they know what you've been talking about. They're intrigued enough to go search you out. So you can create a bit.ly link that will track your episodes, track who's downloading and going to the website from what interview. That way you can see your return on your investment. And that in turn, it's going to bring you money down the line, your services, your products. And it's really all about being generous. And like you said, living in abundance. The more you give, the more you will receive. So give away your knowledge with freebies. And in the end, it's going to turn into income generating listeners, clients, you name it.
In your opinion, and with all of the podcast matchmaking, you have done between hosts and guests, Would you say there are certain freebies, so to speak, that are more effective than others? I've had people come on my show and want to offer discovery calls, right? Which I really prefer them not to do, right? I'd really prefer them to offer something that's something downloadable, get them on your list. You'll have plenty of time to offer that later. But I have seen things that have worked better than others. So since this is your zone of genius, what are some of the things that you feel work better than others?
I think checklists, templates, things that people can use and are of value. I have clients who give away like mini guides, especially if they've got a book that's coming out. Maybe they have a supplement that goes with it to offer something like that. To offer, maybe you're offering the free book or, a discount off of your book or something to that. I think a discovery call is another way to be too salesy. That to me sounds like great. Now I get to call you so you can try to sell me even more than you tried to sell me on the podcast. So I would completely stray away from that. And I would stick to just being generous. Again, live in abundance, give away your knowledge, because as Amy Porterfield will say, the more you give away for free, people are going to say, well, what is it that she's going to give me if I pay her? Because it's obviously going to be even greater than what you give away for free. And that's something that we need to all remember is the more you give, the more you receive. So give away your knowledge, give away templates, checklists, those types of things, and don't be salesy.
Those are some really good ideas on things that people can give away, because it's really not that hard to make a checklist, right? I mean, that's not very difficult. It's not like you have to be super techie and make this really robust 100-page ebook or anything, right? Because you just want them to be curious, so they want the next thing, right? And I think that you summed it up beautifully, if I may say, about if this is what I'm getting from you for free, imagine what I would get if I was paying you. That is just really a good next step. And it is something that is so simple that people really do think like that. That is how they think, right? And so that is really setting the expectation and doing it in a way that's an example, which I think really helps people. So that was really a good point, which kind of leads me to all the great, we talked about it earlier, right, to the resources that you have. But before we start giving away those, will you tell my audience how they can connect with you?
Yes, you can visit my website, themslcollective.com. And you can also see me over on Instagram. I'm very active over there at Michelle Glogovac. And you can link to that from the website as well, too.
Perfect.
And you can listen to me on my Simplified Life podcast. Can't forget that part.
Absolutely, we can't forget that part, for sure. And you did come bearing a gift. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about the gift? She's talked about a lot of things. Make sure you check the show notes. We're going to have links to literally everything she talked about. But why don't you tell them a little bit about the gift so they can get excited?
Yes. So I have a podcast checklist for you, and it tells you exactly what you need to launch your podcast, from the very beginning with a name down to how many episodes that you should have recorded before you launch. And that is my gift to all of your listeners. And like you mentioned, there are other free resources on the website if you'd like to download those as well.
And you are the first person who came on my podcast who actually had 2 gifts. Like, see how generous she is? She actually came with 2 gifts. So tell them a little bit about the other gift you have about the podcast pitching. I love that one.
Yeah, so I do have a podcast pitching resource that tells you all the do's and don'ts and what you should prepare for your pitch and what needs to go into your pitch. And I do a pitch template that you can see on the website as well. But really, it's the best practices of what you need to do to create your own pitch to be interviewed on podcasts.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for being so very, very generous. And now we're at the part of the show that I like to call #OpenMic. This is where I turn the mic over to our guest and ask them to share their number 1 marketing, media, and money strategy, as if you didn't already share so many strategies. But this is my version of social karaoke, #social karaoke. And so I'm going to pass the mic over to you. So will you please share with our guests your number 1, if you had to narrow it down, what's the number 1 marketing, media, and money strategy?
My number 1 strategy would be collaborations. Podcasting is all about collaborating with others, whether you're a guest or you're a host on your own show. I utilize collaborations inside my shows, outside the shows for my clients, and it's going to generate revenue. It's a great way to expand your audience and to create a more robust offering. And really, the hashtag that everybody uses, collaboration over competition. Collaboration is community, and in building these relationships, you're going to build your business and you're going to live in abundance, and everything will grow with it by working with other people in your industry, outside of your industry. And it's a great way to learn more too.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much, Michelle. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being here. We probably are going to have you on again, because really we could have talked about so much more, but I really appreciate you being here with me today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it.
I did too. And to our guests out there listening, thank you so much for taking your time to be with us today. Thank you for joining us here on the Marketing Media Money Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and review, like Michelle said, the podcast on your favorite listening platform. And make sure that you check out our sister publication, the Marketing Media Money Magazine, where you can get your free lifetime subscription at marketingmediamoney.com. So thank you so much. I appreciate you taking your time to be here with us today. I hope everybody has a phenomenal day. If your day isn't phenomenal, remember you have the power to change it.
Thank you for joining us today on the Marketing, Media, and Money Podcast. To shorten your learning curve even more, make sure to grab your free copy of the Marketing, Media, and Money magazine at www.marketingmediamoney.com. I promise your business will thank you.